Well, I'd like to welcome you to another In Conversation at East London Science School. And today we're going to look at the idea of the teacher. I'd like to introduce Mark Taylor, who is the Vice Principal at the school and history teacher and philosophy teacher, and myself, Richard Woolfenden, acting head of sixth form and English teacher. It's mid-June and we are coming out of lockdown. We have a skeleton school of students, and we also have year 10s and year 12s who are gradually getting back in the building and seeing their teachers. It's a very particular moment in education. And Mark is really interested in looking at the idea of the teacher because lockdown has thrown up quite a few questions about the job that we do. And so I'm going to ask Mark some questions, throw it over to him to explore this area. Mark, what are you trying to do by exploring the idea of the teacher?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Well, as you said, the lockdown experience has probably thrown up again this question of the idea of the teacher. What are we? Are we something that is now online? Do we teach through Zoom, which we actually do as a school? We've done a great job at that. And actually there is some actual dynamic experience going on in terms of teaching. A lot of schools have done nothing or some version of online learning. And it threw up immediately questions in my mind about what is a teacher. Now the typical response, I think, has been more what methods can the teacher use or how is learning changing? But I think the time that I had, and I myself was in bed for 6 weeks ill with this damn thing, was to try and read back about some of the different ideas of a teacher. And I do mean the idea of the teacher in a kind of universal sense, not a specific, what are we now? I wanted to look for something that goes beyond the moment we're in, because I think that reminded me of when I first went into the profession, what it was I was trying to do, which is somehow embody some kind of ideal. Now, ideals can be shattered or lived up to, but I found in my own mind that the idea that I could project backwards in order to find what is the now was much more helpful to me than going online, looking at all the blogs or responses that people were putting out, which seemed to be very momentary and, to be honest, lacking in intellectual confidence. I was looking for something that meant, what is it that the teacher stands for, that is perennial and universal, because I feel, possibly wrongly, but it might be that I'm right, is that that's a kind of standard that we may find we can come out of lockdown in a refreshed educational way with. And that idea for me is much more inspirational than the idea of tinkering around with what is learning today, although I'm not obviously discounting the fact that we're in new circumstances.
So, Mark, you've particularly gone back to the Bible and you're looking at the Hebrews because you want to look at what is the idea or even the ideal of the teacher.
Yeah.
Would you be able to share with us what your sort of current thinking is?
Yeah. So it's already been joked that this could become a Bible reading session, but of course the issue is people haven't read the Bible. So one of the things I did during lockdown was to read the Bible. And I'm not saying it was all at all easy, but it was interesting to go back to some of the things I'd heard about as a child, being brought up in a Christian country, as it was then, and to try to sort of work out how I could respond to the idea of education and the teacher in that book. But the reason I want to emphasise the Bible is more because we're not really biblical in the way we think today. In fact, the standout idea that where we come from educationally, the idea of the teacher, is much more of a Greek idea. And even that today may seem alien to people if they're not engaged with the tradition. But here's an example of where I started before I go to the Hebrews. So I don't know, Richard, if you remember the fantastic book, Fatty Puffs and Thinniffers, from your childhood. Have you heard of that?
I've heard the name, but I don't remember it from my childhood.
It was by Andre Morat, who was a a French exile in London during World War II, who also wrote a wide range of literature for adults. But in his memoirs, I mean, that was his only children's book, and it was about a war between two brothers, which I think came from his own experience of conflict in his own family. But he talks about his French education, and as I think about 13, they would have what was called the Year of Philosophy. And he was told by a student, well, you don't know what's coming. You're going to go into there, there's going to be a teacher there, and it won't be like anything you've ever heard before in a class. And it was the teacher, whose name was Émile Chartier, Marat writes. And he said he was sitting in the room with all the other students waiting for this Year of Philosophy, which they had then. And Chartier walks into the room and writes in Greek on the board, which he asked them to translate. And they do translate it, because I think Marat had already had some Greek education. It tells you the amazing standards they had. But of course, we teach Greek at East London Science School. He wrote on the board a translation from Plato, I believe. One must go to the truth with all one's soul. And he just left it there. And Marat writes that this was a life-changing moment. He had had good teachers before then. They taught him French literature, French grammar, and all the sorts of things he needed to engage with that. But they had not blown his mind away as that moment did. And it did strike me that the idea of that teacher somehow living the tradition of thought since the Greeks was a really, really powerful one. And he said it was like a revelation. And I want to add that from my own reading, of course, this Platonic idea, well, it's not the same as Aristotle's idea. Aristotle thinks that you don't get that kind of idea of the truth and the soul in the same way. And Marat was later on aware of this, but he said that the Platonic metaphysicians, if you like, had kind of given you an idea that the ideas of life, including the idea of a teacher, by the way, but the ideas of what words mean are out there in some disembodied way. And Aristotle, Plato's student, had challenged that, even although he was obviously a Platonist because Plato had taught him. And Aristotle challenged it by saying nothing in the intellect or the mind that is not first in the senses. Well, this is already, to me, reading back at this tension, you see the creation of a tradition, and we haven't even talked about Socrates, the man who taught Plato. But it's still brilliant, it still resonates, and it opens our eyes about what a teacher might be. But it ain't what Yahweh says in the Bible. Aristotle seems to say, and does say in his metaphysics, all men desire to know. And he means all men or women. It's a natural thing, which is itself refreshing and gives you a tremendous idea of what a teacher can aspire to. But the Hebrew God Yahweh doesn't really say this at all. In fact, he punishes his people for their constant unwillingness to know what he wants them to know. And if anything, Yahweh, when you read the Old Testament, comes across as actually a really bad teacher. Because every time he exhorts his people, do this, do that, the commandments, well, he's only doing it because they won't do it. They simply will not do what he says. But what he does say, and he's trying to get at, which I think is a universal idea for the teacher to teach, but it's a difficult idea for us. He says you are distinctive to his people. You are distinctive. You're the Jews. And if you follow my advice, you will remain distinctive and different. Now today that strikes us as a very elitist kind of thing to say. But I put it to you, Richard, that unless you have an idea of what is distinctive, you cannot be educated. Because education consists in making distinctions in order to tell yourself what something is, possibly to classify it, and to turn it into abstract knowledge. And I think that's what the Greeks did with their tradition, but in a way, they turned God into an idea as well. And all of that changes what the idea of the teacher is. You're teaching it as Greeks, as saying it's something we can get a handle on, we can control it. But the Old Testament was really different to that. And Yahweh, the name for the Hebrew God at that point, when he says in Exodus, I am that I am, which I've always found is a great thing to teach students. What does that mean then? I am that I am. Is this all he says? I am that I am. Now you try and get your head around that, but what he's saying is, you better bloody listen to me, because I've got the answers. But the weird thing is, he hasn't got any answers. It's not an intellectual project, the worship of the Hebrew God. It's a moral and ethical project. And that's why he's so constantly disappointed by his people who continually let him down. And this leads to a very distinctive idea, distinct again, of what the teacher is, which seems to be to say that you must listen to me. Why? Because I am that I am. Well, I know that's really unfashionable today, but I think there's something in that a teacher is who they are. The idea of the teacher in the Hebrew tradition is that you stand for something just because you are a teacher. This is really uncomfortable for us today because we want to say you must have something to teach. Well, he says he does, but it's the morality and the ethics of Judaism. But he also seems to, if you read the Old Testament, be much more forgiving and understanding and strangely tolerant and very funny than we might expect. And I think that there are ideas in there about what a teacher is that doesn't resonate very easily with us today, but nevertheless I think are worth considering before we get on to the Greeks and their much more intellectually programmed approach to what teaching means.
You've raised a lot of interesting things there. I would like to sort of just ask you about the intellectual project, moral project, and just for you to unpick that a little bit more. Are you saying that teachers today, and why you're looking at the sort of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, don't have a sense of their distinctiveness, either morally or even intellectually? Are they both challenged, or are you particularly focusing on the moral question of being the teacher in front of the class, or are you asking questions about the intellectual tradition of being a teacher?
Yeah.
And with that, just so I'm clear on what you're trying to say, the comparison you're drawing here to teaching, when the Yahweh said to the Jewish people, you are distinctive as a people, and unless you have an idea of that, you can't lead. Is that what you're saying? Or you can't be a people? What was he trying to say?
Well, as far as, so you've asked about three questions, but just one is the intellectual program, one is the morality, and one is what is it? What it makes the people. I think in the early phases of the Old Testament, Genesis and Exodus, he is trying to exhort the people to get their freedom. They're in Israel, and in Genesis he's trying to say don't eat from the tree of knowledge before they become a people. And there's two strands in the early phases of the Bible. There's a priestly strand, the Elohist strand, and a non-priestly strand, which is the Yahweh strand. And they don't all make sense. For example, the creation story is not quite the same in Genesis about this. So we can see it's been put together. And one of the things about it is, as a tradition, it's an amazing book that a group of people have put together. But the problem is, to put it in a simple sense, is you've got the priests, the Levites, and the book of Deuteronomy, you try to codify what they think this God means, and you've got prophecy, which tries to tell the people that they're not doing what God actually meant, and is constantly telling them off for saying you've gone the right way. And this eventually leads to the destruction of the temple in 586 BC, and that's when the Jews are homeless. Their God has failed them. They've been captured by the Babylonians, as they've been repeatedly attacked throughout history, and they simply have no basis to go forward as teachers except through the diaspora, which leads to a different kind of teaching. So the rabbi and the Talmud, a different book, which does have a good debate in it with the Greek tradition. So what I'm getting at is that God's continual disappointment by the people he's elected, And even like Moses and Moses' brother, when the issue with the golden calf, he gets so angry with them for disobeying. I always think the golden calf is a bit like a girl who comes into school with jewellery in her ear, and the school's got a strict behaviour or uniform policy. Well, that story, when you say, what, is that a golden calf in your ear? It leads to an interesting response. Which God are you worshipping? Yourself or the idea of the school and what the school stands for? And Moses tries to say in the words of God, my teaching drops like rain. But it obviously doesn't. It constantly falls on barren ground. And so a whole load of books in the Bible are about this attempt to bring back the understanding of God and how he supposedly meant these great ideas he's got to the people that just refuse to listen and continually disseminate really the ideas of this distinctiveness. And then that's why you end up with the commandments, not written once, but twice in the Bible in two different books. So you can see that it's not so much an intellectual program as a program of moral regeneration and recovery. So if that's okay, jumping onto is it a moral project? Well, I think, and for today, I mean, I mentioned the prophets, and the most famous one is probably people like Isaiah, who comes up with the idea that there's some kind of suffering servant. It's the idea that possibly Jesus is prefigured. But essentially what the prophets are getting at is that is actually Judaism not distinctive? Could it be universal? And if you agree that the Old Testament leads to the New, you can say that there's this constant pressure to say, stop being so distinctive, let people come in. The foreskin you need to circumcise is in your heart, not in your body, that kind of approach. But what I have found really interesting in the prophets, is, and in particular a minor one called Habakkuk, is the question he raised, because Habakkuk is very interesting. He has a debate with God in a very Greek dialectical way. And some of the later books of the Bible do have Greek influences because of the role of Alexander the Great and Hellenism in general in spreading ideas. He says to God, what are you trying to do, essentially? And God's saying, well, I'm sick of you worshipping idols. I can't stand it, just like the golden calf all those years ago. What use is an idol once its maker has shaped it, God says. It's just a cast image. It's a teacher of lies. Its maker trusts what's been made, even though the idol cannot speak. And God just keeps going at this. Alas for all of you who say to the wood, wake up. The wood ain't going to wake up. Rouse yourself. And his final word in this section of Habakkuk is, can it teach? Obviously the answer is no, it cannot. What he's saying is, it's not just me recovering an idea of a teacher. He is also saying there's only one teacher, and the idea of the teacher you need is me. That is so arrogant to us. However, have I seen it in today's classrooms? Not much. And I wonder if it could come back and what it would do. The next question is, what's it based on? I don't believe that teachers can just go around saying they're teachers, because they don't have that authority. But I think in looking at this book or these books, it's very interesting to ask ourselves, where does that authority come from a teacher? Is it something they sort of inhabit and live morally, or is it God-given? And of course, we know that in today's world, certainly in East London, teachers have got to earn their spurs, otherwise you're going to get roasted. And the weird thing is, God's behaviour policy, if you like, is in tatters for centuries. Nobody seems to really follow it, but it continually regenerates itself. And I think the strange thing coming out of this constant failure is that God has incredible perseverance to say, I'm not going to stop, and I've got patience, and we're going to keep going with this until he gets the kind of leadership team, the prophets, if you like, that he wants. And well, who's the greatest prophet? I said possibly Isaiah, but if you know Martin Luther King, as we're a lot talking about Black Lives Matters, he uses Amos, let justice roll down and righteousness roll down and so on. And that comes out of this idea that you can regenerate this tradition and do something with it today. And I think that idea still has resonance.
Mark, if we look at today and all the things that you've raised about the sort of moral and intellectual independence of the teacher from your reading of the Bible, can we sort of just have a think about what we might have to do in getting schools back to working normally, given that in some people's eyes and in the public eye, teaching and the teacher might be a bit compromised at the moment?
Yeah. So I do think the teacher's been a bit compromised at the moment. The idea of the teacher, if it was stronger, taking into account all the evidence for the medical situation, I think if the idea of the teacher was stronger, we would have had schools moving much faster, getting back to learning in schools. And there's no substitute for a teacher in front of the students, with the proviso that teacher has been doing some reading or pushing themselves in order to make sure their lessons are as good as they can be. And I think so in addition to the fact that where we are now because of COVID, there's a secondary question really to answer, which is what kind of teacher have we got today? And what kind of things do we now call education? And I say things with a bit of caution, because I think too much people are saying just children in front of you, classroom or online, is just learning. And I think even some schools who've not even tried Zoom lessons, which I think to our credit we have, so we've found out where the kids are at, they are not doing that. So there's no attempt really to engage with what this teacher-student relationship can be. But I've got what I think is a great example, is where I think, if you know the book of Samuel in the Bible, which is where the David and Goliath story is, and it's a wonderful book. It ends up with, in I think a later book of Samuel, David, of course, becomes king. He sends off Uriah Heep to fight and die in order that he can have his affair with Bathsheba. They get punished, they lose a child, but they then have another child because God forgives them, and that is Solomon, whose wisdom is famous. It's an amazing book because if you look at the story of David and Goliath, we tend to think of it as very simple, a giant killer. But if you read it in detail, the early phases, David hears about this giant who's a Philistine and wants to kill him, and tries to go down and find out what's going to happen if this happens. And he hears that there could be some kind of prize from the king. And his brother hears him trying to do this. He says, "You're just a shepherd, go back to your sheep, what are you doing?" And David, in a classic sort of sulky teenager kind of way, but in a way that I love, and I think a great teacher should be encouraging. I'm not saying you necessarily encourage the consequences because they're violent, but okay, violence is, in a legitimate sense, is something that most countries need to confront. But in this case, David says, "Well, what have I done? What have I done now?" to his brother. It was only a question. And it's like that kid in the classroom that is always having a go at you as a teacher because your logic's not good enough. And if it was good enough, they'd go with you. Well, this tells us that the idea of the teacher in this tradition is almost all the way through every book. There's something there about what this can be. But in this particular case, I think it says, let those questions be asked, or find those kids who've got those questions, and they're going to be tough. Now, of course, in the end, this question, Saul gets to hear about it, the king, who later is hunting down David, because David's reputation is that he's killed 10,000s and Saul's only a few thousand, or something like that. Well, Saul says to him, "Well, what is it you want to do? Just let me out there. I'm going to have a go at Goliath." And Saul decides to let him go. He gives the kid a chance, and he packs his pebbles, gets his sling ready, and goes to battle. They insult each other. Goliath tells what he's going to do to him. And of course, David, don't forget, has been offered Saul's armour, takes it off, don't want to wear it. It's very Homeric. Doesn't take the sword, gets in the way. So he's just out there really, not dressed in much, going to have a go. And he puts a stone right in the forehead of Goliath, takes him down, and then takes his sword, cuts his head off. There's a lot of heads being cut off in the Bible. Let's not go there. But what I'm getting at is that there's lessons here, both in terms of the mind. He was thinking, what can I do with foresight? which Michelangelo captures in David, in his statue of David, by the way, in the Renaissance, also used for political reasons. But there's foresight, there's intellectual foresight here, and there's moral awareness here. Put it all together and you've got a great mini encapsulation of this, what is the idea of the teacher in many of the books of the Old Testament, and what does it mean to learn, what's the knowledge you need, and what's authority. And it's all there, and this particular book it does it brilliantly. But there are many such books that I think we could engage with in a deeper way, and learn something from as teachers. And in that sense, it can make us aware of where things are weak, but in particular, it can regenerate how we think of the idea of the teacher, and not at all compromise other ideas about it, such as we hopefully will look at in future sessions on the Greeks, for example, or the Victorians and their idea of culture. But there's something in the Old Testament, I think, that has been lost. And if we have a look at it, I think we can bring some of it back without becoming dogmatic. We can become better teachers.
Thank you very much. This has been an In Conversation with Mark Taylor about the idea of the teacher, and I look forward to further conversations.
Thank you.